You ever wonder about which engines you want to avoid because it could cause you a lot of trouble? Well, I've got your first one. Right here we have a vehicle that clearly burned roadside. So bad, in fact, the entire engine is charcoal briquettes. We have burn marks here as well. The fire department's just left. We got water dripping out and the interior is literally burned to a crisp. No, fortunately, nobody got hurt in this situation, but clearly we burned the fenders, we burned the hood, the windshield's blown out, as is the roof on this vehicle. And what we're dealing with is a Santa Fe Hyundai product, and it's a Sport 2.0 turbo all-wheel drive. And so what happened? It's the Theta II engine that you want to avoid. Rod bearings, they overheat because there's particulate floating around in the oil, ends up cooking the rod bearings, burn the engine. There's also been a lot of recalls with electrics, and it's just a bad engine. Theta II, Hyundai, Kia, forget about it.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
Some of the worst drivetrain technology mustered up into one vehicle. Yes, we're talking about the Ford EcoSport, or EcoTurd for short, but what it has is a 1-liter engine. Catastrophic dumpster fire on wheels. So what's the problem with it? Well, the main problem is it's got a wet belt. It is susceptible to fractures, and you could lose power steering, power brakes, and the engine could go poof. The worst part is with the wet timing belt, it actually prevents the timing from maintaining correct synchronization, and you could have piston and valve problems. On top of it, have you ever heard an oil pump that wasn't driven by gears? That's right, almost every vehicle that you see on the lot anywhere at any time is driven by a type of gear train that actually is built of steel gears, and they were forcing the oil to all the parts that need lubrication. But Ford, in all their infinite wisdom, in their 1-liter EcoSport engine, had to go and use something a little different. Yes, they actually used a belt-driven oil pump, which is susceptible to failure, and when it does at 60 or 70,000 miles, boom, and the engine is gone. Basically, transmission, engine failures. That 1-liter turbo engine by Ford EcoSport is a literal disaster, and don't walk away, run away. And right here we have a vehicle with engine and drivetrain under the hood of a vehicle brand that wish they could literally forget about it, put it in the past, and never look back. Because the engine under this hood has been a problem child for many, many thousands of customers who have literally just gone on and just ultimately regretted the brand because of the engine that's sitting under this hood. Now, it has been continually developed, and TU Upgrades has got this engine into a little better spot today. It's a lot better, a lot more reliable in the latest generation, but it's still a very expensive engine to maintain, still has its share of issues. But this first generation V8 engine, called the 4.4-liter twin turbo V8, also known as the N63, is the big troublemaker here. And yeah, while you see those engines typically in larger cars like this is a large 7 Series vehicle, as you can see with the kidney grills up front. This is a large estate vehicle. Obviously large, basic looking wheels. Here's an X-Drive, means you get all-wheel drive with this. You do get LED tail lights. Of course, this is an upgrade. The 750i is the car by BMW that we're talking about. And yes, it has some nice details like chrome handles. You also get this nice brushed chrome along the window line. It's a gorgeous vehicle. That's where the beginning of the end is, because this engine under this hood, even though it had a strong automatic transmission, this engine was the source of a lot of stress, anger, and even some divorces. Well, let's start with the front. We have a V8 engine, as mentioned, 4.4-liter displacement. That in itself isn't the issue. What is the issue is timing chains were known to eat up. Yes, timing chain guides, ramps would crumble, and of course the chains could skip a cog, and you have piston and valve collision. That was an ugly problem. If it wasn't bad enough, you also had premature battery draw because this car sat around so long waiting for servicing. The battery usually died, and then you had to reboost it or charge it. On top of that, you had other issues because it was a hot V. They go and stick 2 turbos, and the exhaust manifolds of those turbos are extremely hot. Like, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But that heat was packaged right in the nest of the V8 engine, right in the valley, where it created all kinds of problems. Started melting down valve guide seals, which led to a mass amount of oil consumption. Also melted down plastic, wiring harnesses. You had problems with gaskets starting to leak, and all the coolant lines, which were essentially made of plastic, were also prematurely told and start to leak. So almost everything under the hood of this vehicle took a beating because of the excess heat that wasn't shielded properly, poor injection systems, timing chain rattle issues, and as well, of course, naturally, electronic troubles through and through. This car was a real nemesis, and unfortunately for BMW, it didn't begin and end with the 7 Series. You saw it in 5 Series as well. And although it provided plenty of punch and a great level of tractable performance, the sad reality is you didn't get to drive it very long before you had to tow it into the shop again for another catastrophic failure. Now, allegedly, BMW had this customer care thing set up where they would monitor it. They'd come in, they'd assess the fuel consumption over a period of time. If it exceeded a certain ratio, they might take a course of action. If they didn't, they wouldn't. So it just became a fumbling mess of affairs that customers had to take an extra sense of ownership on. So as a result, the early generation BMW N63 is definitely one you want to avoid like the plague. Now here's a couple of Sputniks with some of the worst engines. Yes, in 2013, Ford went ahead and redesigned the Ford Escape. As you see right here, it's a very cab forward design. As you see like this, the old one was more of a box, and then they converted this to create a little different style. Kind of brought some new innovation to the style detail. I mean, it did come with some great headlights. Yes, you have these Pep Boys looking Canadian Tire type fake looking grills, cheap looking mirrors. Of course, you do get this. This is kind of cheaply done as well. And of course, everything on here is quite cheap. But basically, they give you an updated set of taillights, and the Escape had a small 4-cylinder engine they carried over. It was naturally aspirated. And this is what you have right here is the EcoBoost. And this is where things went off the rails. You have a 1.6 liter turbo 4-cylinder engine called the EcoBoost in this particular model here in 2014. But that first generation of the revamp was one of the worst engines. 1.6 liters of fire-breathing fury. That's after fire pours out from under the hood, because this car had a recall for some issues with potential oil leaks, coolant leaks, consuming coolant, consuming oil, blowing turbos, blowing engines, and even more importantly, head gaskets and expensive repairs. The worst part is they might actually last 30 or 40 or 50,000 miles and people think they're out of the woods. Warranty's come and gone, the ship has sailed, and then they blow a head gasket. That's a common issue with some of these 1.6 liter turbo EcoBoost Ford engines, an absolute disaster of an engine. And Ford has struggled with direct injection, variable valve timing, turbocharging. They brought it all to the table at once and really messed the whole onslaught up. In my personal opinion, you don't want the 1.6 liter turbo 4-cylinder EcoBoost engine by Ford. So maybe you're a younger buyer and you decide, hey, I want to get my hands on a fast, tunable little sports car. And here you have a la BMW. Well, I had one of these once, and I can tell you from personal experience, these have literally the best and the worst engines. Best from a tuning perspective, the worst from reliability. You literally can't keep them on the road long enough to actually enjoy the vehicle. That's the sad part. You'll typically find them in the smaller vehicles, the 2, 3 Series, 5 Series vehicles. And yes, let's take a quick look. Of course, what we have here is a BMW. Everybody loves this style. This is one of the most robust styles. E90, E92 generation carries that engine that we're talking about here. You have the beautiful angel eyes. Of course, beautiful rims on there. This one's X-Drive, so you get all-wheel drive there. Small little mirrors, and of course, a little sunroof. This one's 2 doors, just like mine was the coupe. And of course, it's a gorgeous little unit. Of course, this is the updated. You have the updated tail lights on this unit, and it's a 335 BMW. Now, this gives you dual exhaust, gives you 300 horsepower. You can get it in an automatic transmission, or you can even get a 6-speed manual. It's a wonderful thing to drive when it works. But it has what they call the N54 engine, twin turbo, straight 6, and they haven't gone back to twin turbos since then, unless they've gone to the M versions. But all the regular non-M cars have stuck with a single turbo twin scroll. This one is the exception. It's the first generation in 07 it came out, and they carried the N54, which is a 3-liter twin turbo straight 6, makes about 300 ponies and about 300 pound-feet of torque. And it's a fun little car when it runs, but it ends up costing a huge amount of money, or that hood's open every second week trying to fix coolant leaks. Of course, right over here, you have an oil filter housing. It has coolant leaks on it, oil leaks, big problem to get at, because to get that removed, there's a bolt. That bolt is covered by the intake manifold, which you have to remove. To remove that intake manifold, you have to remove the upper deck here. And it's a whole pile of work to do, including the cross bracing. And it's just a nightmare to do oil leak repairs on these vehicles. Coolant leaks, of course, lots of classic plastic pipes that fail. Water pumps, electric, they fail, and they're huge bucks. And we're talking about $1,500 if you do it yourself, and you're managed to be a great do-it-yourselfer. Yes, you're $1,500 for the parts, for the water pump, as well as the thermostat. And you've got to kind of do them while they're in there together. The piezo fuel injectors, which were common failures, usually they were done under some sort of warranty extension by BMW, but those can come back, or for those that haven't been rectified. Piezo injectors, the fuel pump is high pressure, direct injected, huge money to repair that. Of course, over here, here, you have the two turbos on this side of the engine, and those have wastegate rattle. Turn the car off, you hear a little clink. That's a common issue. Timing chains, valve cover gasket leaks, as well as pan cover leaks underneath. And so while the gearbox is good and the rest of the car feels solid, that engine is a literal and utter disaster. It didn't take very long for BMW to figure it out. They transitioned to the N55, which sorted some of the issues. Didn't quite get it right that time. Now they have the B58, which is almost bulletproof. So that was a dud of an engine, and one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. And here we have another one that it really pains me, because I personally own a Honda, but I own one of the older naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engines with a torque converter automatic transmission. It is actually bulletproof, and it's in a Honda Civic. But what we have now is a newer generation of engines, and Honda, as we know, Honda and Acura have struggled in recent years here with some reliability issues from their transmission issues, and more specifically the engine that you find in this vehicle. And a lot of vehicles, you find them in the CR-V and you find them in the Honda Civic. And generally, Honda is known to be a reliable brand. They have a great reputation for racing, and they definitely have a reputation for building a lot of quality small engines. But I think they went too far here. Here, the Honda CR-V is a great looking unit, has some great hips, chrome bar on the front, of course, lots of nice detail there, beautiful wheels, laser cut style, small mirrors, very basic handles, although very easy to access in. Of course, they're very simple on top, nothing much there. And of course, they have that nice chrome ring around the windows. And you look around here, definitely unique, very Volvo-like, except with their own little touch on it. And of course, we're talking about a turbo right here, and this one's all-wheel drive. But unfortunately, it's the engine that's in these, as well as some Civics, and you've probably heard about it. It's all over the net. It's a 1.5 liter turbo 4-cylinder engine. Now, while it's not the most disastrous piece of junk of an engine, it definitely has had way too many problems, and there's a well-known issue. And it's at a point where you have to pretty much baby it. You have to administer extra oil services. You have to keep an eye on it. And sadly, it feels like Honda was a little bit pushed into the corner, as are a lot of manufacturers now, having to create a very small displacement engines, having to create engines with direct fuel injection to better metering, better fuel economy. All this new technology in the drivetrains are causing some of these reliability issues. And Honda is no different. With their 1.5 liter turbo 4, they're pushing way too much fuel, sometimes when the car's not allowed to warm up properly, as in you start it and you drive away, or the car's extremely cold, or you're driving really hard when the car's not warmed up, or pretty much any other condition. What you can have is, because it's direct injected, there's high pressure pushing that fuel past the rings. The rings aren't expanded yet, and you're getting a lot of fuel into the oil down below in the crankcase, and then that breaks down the oil. I mean, oil, we all know, needs to lubricate the engines, the rod bearings, the cam lobes, and all those other internal parts, including the turbocharger bearings themselves. But as soon as you start pushing that pressure across a set of loose rings that aren't expanded yet, what you have is fuel in there. And gasoline is essentially a solvent. It's no different than paint thinner, made to wash away oily substances. But that's what ends up happening. You wind up with that fuel in the oil, breaks it down, prevents the proper lubrication of the engine. And there's lots of conversation and stories and examples of people who have actually blown up their engines or had extreme premature wear in a short period of time because of the way this engine was designed. High pressure fuel going in, cold engine not expanded properly, and of course now you have a real issue. Saddens me to say this about Honda. I hope that they can get this figured out. And I know there are people that say, well, they have, you just got to do more frequent oil changes, give the car adequate time to warm up before you set off, and all these little administrative functions. But at the end of the day, it's a design and an application problem that has caused this 1.5 liter turbo 4 in the Hondas to fail. And here's a vehicle with some of the worst engines. Well, now this is a later model, and we're looking JCW, which is the John Cooper Works vehicle. These are absolutely gorgeous and a ton of fun. That one's a shout out for you, Mario. And of course, here we have a set of dual exhaust tips right there. And it's a beautiful little unit. Look, even in the taillights, it has that British flag logo in there. Of course, you have this nice little overhang here. Now, again, this is the sporty version of the BMW Mini, of course. And you have this beautiful little clamshell hood right here. Absolutely beautiful. I love the alignment here. It's so tight and crisp between the ring and, of course, the headlight. This is definitely a work of art. Of course, you get the big red calipers, beautiful alloy wheels. I love the little bug-eyed type mirror on this thing as well. And look, lots of glass on top. So you get lots of illumination inside for all the happy riders in this vehicle. And happy they'll be, especially in the JCW version. But one of the worst engines I have to tell you about isn't the second generation of the Mini, it's the first generation. Now, the first and second generation both had a 1.6 liter turbo 4. It's the first generation from 2002 to 2006 that featured an engine that was also shared with the likes of the PT Loser Cruiser as well as the Dodge Neon. It wasn't a well-built piece and it had a host of issues. Later on in 06, BMW also then built their own, also had some issues. And of course, the problem with that is BMW parts in a car like this that you think is economical, but it becomes luxury car standards for cost. But it was the early generation, the 1.6 liter engine that was shared in the Neon and the PT Cruiser were the ones with the problems, and they had a host of them. Some of the issues were timing chain rattle, and if it started to get the rattlesnake sound up front, beware, you better get your car to the shop and get that sorted out quickly, because often that was too much slack in the chain. If you had too much slack in the chain and it let go, you could wind up, of course, with a piston and valve collision, writing off that engine. Fuel pump failures, another potential issue that is very common for some reason on these vehicles, as is the temperature sensor failure, which does get a little costly in BMW's world. Variable valve timing was also a troublesome area, as it was in a lot of BMWs. That carries through to Minis as well, unfortunately. And another big problem was crankshaft seals. These vehicles were notorious for oil leaks, especially the early generation. Nobody wants to drive a car around that leaves a little stain, you know, like a dog whizzing on every tree that it goes by. Well, that's what the early generation Minis were doing with that 1.6. They were leaving stains everywhere, oil stains. Crankshaft seal was a common one. That was always a hard one for a lot of vehicles to keep together. Your main seal is an area of common failure. If you're using the wrong material, which they did, you were guaranteed to have leaks. So between troublesome running issues, timing chain rattle, leaks, these engines were problematic at least, and a trip to the dumpster at worst. The 1.6 liter BMW Mini, definitely one for the scrap. And here's another one that's a literal disaster. And it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, when we're talking about Chevy and GM, they've certainly had their share of duds. What we have here is a Chevy Cruze. So we've talked about that, bad gearboxes, bad troubles with all sorts of fit and finish, weak body panels. But the big issue is that engine. It's a 1.4 liter turbo 4-cylinder LUV engine by GM, and it's shared with the Sonic or the Cruze, and they are duds. What kind of engine problems would you actually have with this? Blown head gaskets is a common issue for this. Drivability problems, injection fuel problems. But the big one, of course, they've talked about detonation, and there's lots of conversation about people with blown holes in a piston to where basically it results in smoke billowing out the back and this engine catastrophically failing, yielding this whole vehicle that actually looks pretty nice from the outside like this, a total trash master ready for the dumpster. It's that 1.4 liter, essentially an Ecotec engine by Chevy or GM. That's definitely not a great engine. And with all of that said, right there, check it out. Maybe you're looking for something a little more Italian and understand why, in fact, you can get such an amazing deal on a used Maserati. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.